This is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
In our society, there are many forces that are constantly pulling on us, pulling on our attention, pulling on our allegiance, and pulling on us as far as our day-to-day life, whether it be in terms of how we raise our children, how we even think, what stations we listen to, what we do with our free time. And talking to many Jews as a rabbi in the community, I see this constant struggle that goes on between people trying to put into the proper perspective what exactly is the importance in their life of their own secular values and of their religious values. And this conflict is a conflict that we all deal with, whether we're living in even a borough park or we're living out in the suburbs or wherever we might be. And I asked a young rising star, a rabbi who is a very dynamic speaker, a person who is the rabbi of Temple Bethel in Long Beach, to be on board with us today in order to be able to discuss just this very issue. I'd like to introduce you to Rabbi M Hecht. Rabbi Hecht, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me on your show today, Rabbi Teldin.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
I look forward. It's a very interesting topic, and I look forward to really getting into it, and hopefully for our audience being able to elucidate at some points concerning this, that people will have a clearer idea in their own lives about how to balance that constant struggle. But before we get started, I do want to hear from you a little bit about the wonderful work that you're doing in Long Beach. I know you have a wonderful synagogue. You started right around 9/11, and which must have been a very tumultuous time to start in a rabbinical position. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Actually, I find it as a point in my life that the two things coincided, 9/11 and the beginning of our tenure in Temple Bethel of Long Beach. I think Long Beach is a very unique city. It's a very unique place. First of all, the aesthetics of Long Beach are absolutely beautiful. It's a beautiful city. It's on the southwestern shore of Long Island. It's by the ocean. And Temple Bethel is a synagogue that's going to be experiencing its 75th birthday.
Very nice.
Yeah, this is July, I believe, 75th year. Long Beach has a very interesting history to it, and it wouldn't be fair to bore our audience this morning with going through all the details of the history of Long Beach, but some of the points that I would like to make is that most recently there has been a much larger interest, I find, within the Long Beach community to explore spiritual concepts of life and spiritual identity.
Do you attribute that to 9/11, or do you think that's also something that's been developing before 9/11?
Well, I think there are two factors at hand, and one is for us to just understand the very basics of the makeup of Long Beach. In the early 1950s, Long Beach was known to be one of the largest Jewish cities per capita in the United States. Long Beach has approximately 40,000 residents today. It's a beautiful city. It's actually over a little island, and it's 38,000 residents today are comprised of approximately 40% Jewish residents.
Really?
To say that there are approximately 15,000 to 18,000 Jews living in Long Beach today would be a fair statement. Often in talking to the other rabbis and the clergy and then some of the lay leaders within the city, there are always the question as to exact number and so on, but it certainly would be fair to say that there are 15,000 Jews in Long Beach.
But that's still a significant decrease from back in the 50s.
Yes, interestingly enough, it is. Years ago, there was still a much larger population within the Long Beach community, and what happened was essentially a lot of the younger generation of the people that settled within Long Beach some 20, 30 years ago didn't retain their homes or the Long Beach identity for whatever reason. Many of them moved out to the five towns, those that were part of the more religious environment, and I'd say a lot of them, the elderly ones, moved on to Florida and so on. So it's fair to say that Long Beach, to some extent, has gone through a metamorphosis in the last 10 years in the type of Jew that lives here. Today in Long Beach, you have, I would say, 95% of the Long Beach community, the Jewish community, is non-affiliated.
Non-affiliated completely?
Well, I wouldn't say that.
Do you do something in order to try to reach out to that community from your position as a rabbi of the synagogue?
Absolutely. You see, in coming to Long Beach, my first and primary responsibility was to our synagogue. Temple Bethel of Long Beach has a beautiful membership, and it runs and functions like every other synagogue. But one of the concerns that we had was to increase our membership and to reach out to the community in a fashion that transcends just the everyday today things within the synagogue.
Right, which sometimes when you have an Orthodox synagogue, it can be quite intimidating. Sometimes people are very, very they have a hard time overcoming that label. And those labels themselves are, in many ways, an obstacle for a Jew feeling comfortable with being a part of a synagogue like that.
Interesting.
How do you overcome that?
Interesting point. One of the things that were actually working in my best interest was the name of the synagogue. Temple Bethel, the word temple usually connotates a non-religious or non-Orthodox synagogue. Non-Orthodox synagogue, I'm sorry. And the fact of the matter is that from its inception, Temple Bethel has always been an Orthodox synagogue based on Orthodox bylaws. But I look at it as an advantage. Because of my philosophy and because of my background, I'm always looking out to reach out to the people in the community, irrespective to their affiliation, whatever denomination they're from within Judaism. I don't label a Jew by what he is or she is affiliated with. I label a Jew with their want and desire and their essence that they are a Jew. So we started different projects within the synagogue that were actually projects that were meant to reach out to the community at large. We started a preschool within the synagogue, and we reignited the Talmud Torah, the Hebrew school that Temple Bethel had, such a beautiful, wonderful Talmud Torah some years ago. The fact of the matter is that despite some of the pessimists that were involved, we have actually brought in a wonderful number of children in both of these activities, in both the preschool as well as the Talmud Torah. And this has proven to be a lifeline from the synagogue to outreach to these people and bring them in and draw their attention and their interest into the synagogue
Very
walls.
Nice. Excellent.
And I think that the temple and its board of directors is committed to continue along next year with both of these programs and continue catering to the community as well as helping to build their own membership.
Let me ask you a question. Amongst the pessimists who have seen that you've actually produced this, and I'm segueing into our topic a little bit, do they see that you have a particular understanding of the quote-unquote secular or non-religious, non-Orthodox mind that they perhaps did not have their finger on, that gave you the ability to reach out and do something and to continue a relationship with these people that perhaps surprises them?
Well, it's an interesting question, and the answer to that question, I think that we'd have to be fair with the reality. Did they know that that was my character before I came? I would suppose that some of them did understand that. The reality is that the Orthodox element of Long Beach, as I mentioned earlier, has been on the decline. And the only way, realistically, to rebuild a synagogue today in Long Beach, a vibrant synagogue and a healthy synagogue, is to reach out to the people that are there. Realistically,
Right,
those
exactly.
people really don't have an affiliation or have a limited affiliation with Judaism. So any rabbi that would come along to rebuild a synagogue today in Long Beach would have to be one who is accepting and tolerant and sort of very inspirational with this concept of reaching out.
And incidentally, it's an interesting phenomenon that they did take you as a rabbi. You're a son of a Chabad rabbi, the grandson of a Chabad rabbi, and as a result, people are in the Orthodox synagogues who are in these types of communities where they realize they're not going to be able to bring a lot of Orthodox people to move out to their communities, need somebody like Chabad in order to be able to cultivate in the community itself and find the words and the means to interest the non-affiliated with joining their synagogue as opposed to perhaps joining any synagogue or not joining at all.
I think that it's fair to say, and I'm acknowledging what you're saying, that in the subconscious of some of the people that made the decision some 18 or 19 months ago when I was hired to be the rabbi, that they realized the demographics and the reality of Long Beach, and they said, who better to create a revival and a renaissance within a synagogue than a Chabad person based on the reality within Long Beach today, and that is to reach out to all these people and so on. But I must say that I have encountered a lot of interesting people and experiences within the Long Beach community in doing this outreach work based on the present-day realities of whatever it is that's going on within Long Beach. You have a lot of unaffiliated, and I'd even say assimilated Jews that live in Long Beach, and people are getting to know that there is this young rabbi and his wife that live at the West End that are involved in doing these programs and projects to A, promote their synagogue, and B, also to reach out to the Long Beach community. One of the most interesting relationships that I've developed in Long Beach over the last year and a half, and one that has a very, very strong effect on me personally, is a relationship with one of the senior rabbis within Long Beach, Rabbi Herman, the rabbi from the Temple Emmanuel. And him and I have a very unique relationship, and I think it's perceived...
Is that a reformer or conservative temple?
Temple Emmanuel is the premier synagogue, premier temple within Long Beach. It is a Reform synagogue, and I would say it's fair to say that Rabbi Herman's synagogue today has the largest membership in number. Rabbi Herman is a very unique individual, a very special person, and a good friend of mine. We've become very close friends. He is very open to exploring what it is that Orthodox Judaism is all about, its philosophy and so on. But more uniquely, he has a passion in understanding this outreach work and this philosophy that Chabadism is based on. So I find our relationship to be very unique and very helpful to my work that has to be accomplished within the Long Beach community. People use this as an example of Rabbi Hecht's or Mendel Hecht's outgoingness and his acceptance of all different Jews from all different walks of life, irrespective to the title of the hat that they may wear.
Right. Well, I have to give Rabbi Herman credit for overseeing perhaps some of the past disagreements that Chabad, of course, has had in very strong ways with some of the representatives from Reform, or some of the philosophies and teachings of the Reform movement. And I agree with that. Once a person could look at Chabad or look at Torah without the labels, without the baggage, without the politics, and this not only applies, of course, to rabbis, this applies to anybody, to be able to look at it for the core lesson that it represents and the application to our lives as far as how to be a better person, how to live a more fulfilling life, how to be able to find deep, deep principles that have been developed over thousands and thousands of years of great sages. It's something that for many people would be a very revealing adventure.
Right, that I often wonder in terms of our relationship, how his colleagues would take to our relationship. And one thing that I do commend him for is, notwithstanding some of the ideological differences that we do have, you got to remember that Rabbi Herman is a senior rabbi, a very well-respected individual who has led his flock in the Reform movement for a long time, can sit and talk to me, sheer, philosophize, talk about ideological issues, and yet say, well, I got to tell you, Mendel, I differ here and I differ here, and yet remain friends and still be a very strong driving force behind a lot of the work that I'm doing. He has come to realize that Chabad is not only an outreach movement, but Chabad above what it really is, which is a philosophy going back some 300 years based on mysticism and Kabbalah and so on and so forth. He is actually fascinated by this, and this is something that's very, very real to him. And this relationship has brought me to a lot of new inroads within the Long Beach community. So I think that that's a very interesting and unique experience that I'm having in Long Beach.
Now, let's go from the microcosm to the macrocosm. Take what you're doing in Long Beach. Let's talk about the issue that I introduced in the beginning as far as this attempt to bridge the gap between the secular and the religious. And not that a person can't be religious by secular. I want to say that as an introduction, and that's not something that I would abide by at all. But I'm talking about in terms of looking at life either from a perhaps Orthodox, non-Orthodox Jewish perspective, or being just involved with the secular world, touching upon the religious world. This is a conflict that people deal with on a regular basis. And too often it's presented, I think, as a dichotomy that is unbridgeable. And obviously in your work, you work day to day with how to bridge that gap, because you're dealing with people in the secular world and trying to introduce or infuse into their world Jewish, religious Torah thought that will be able to sanctify even their mundane secular perspective in a way that they'll feel Jewish in their day-to-day activity. So how do we do that on a larger scale as far as discussing the issue at large?
Well, I think that a lot of that has to do with the part of the individual. Many laymen, or the average person, I find often people tend to think that because they're affiliated or associated with a certain dimension of Judaism, they therefore cannot experience things or aspects of ritual or spirituality that are usually in confluence with Orthodox or traditional Judaism. And what I find is
I just want to expand on that.
Go ahead.
I think you just hit the nail on the head as far as how so many Jews react. You can come to them and say, you know, I'm a Chabad rabbi. Oh, I belong to a synagogue.
Right.
Or a rabbi, you know, I'll invite them to come to the sister. No, I belong to Hadassah.
Right.
You know, it's as if everybody's pledging allegiance. And there's a big Jewish world out here, especially, you know, we live in the Newark metropolitan area. So many parents, I plead with them. I say, listen, you might belong to a synagogue, whatever synagogue it might be. You have so many resources within 15 miles of you to expose your children, to expose yourself, to be able to take advantage of things. And people somehow find it very comfortable just to have this one affiliation. And I can only assume that it's because of just a lack of interest. I would hope that it's not because people feel they have to make allegiance and anything else would be somehow a traitor to the cause.
Right. I want to say that I believe we're living in a very smart world, and I'm not going to label people out there as ignorant. I wouldn't dare do that. I believe there is a misconception on the part of a lot of people in terms of what religion really is, and that's partially due to what religion has become within America. You see, today, if you take coming from the suburbs now, living in Long Beach for so long, what has become a part of life is, okay, and which synagogue do you belong to, which way of religion do you belong to? The point that I'm trying to make is as follows. You can have a family growing up in a secular atmosphere within a suburb, and take it Long Beach for that matter, and you have many different things. You're part of the Y, you're part of the library, you're part of this movement, and you're also part of this synagogue, and basically that's just an identity aspect, not realizing that a synagogue, for what it stands for, Judaism, for what it is, really transcends just that relationship in terms of, okay, I'm buying membership into something, and this is who I am. You are really much more than that, because you are a Jew. And I take my relationship with Rabbi Herman as the primary example to that. Often people say to him, he associates himself with you, Mendel, with you, but you're a Reform rabbi. And people often say to me, Rabbi Hecht, but he's a Reform rabbi. Precisely, exactly. A Reform rabbi, a conservative rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi. It isn't about that label. You have to take off that level of concealment within life and say, okay, what really stands and what really lies deep under that? Mm-hmm. A lot of those labels and concealment have blossomed as part of the American philosophy, right, the secularism towards Judaism, and so on. And I think that when people identify that that's not really what it's all about, and wow, look how accepting this quote-unquote Orthodox rabbi is, mm-hmm, to me, a quote-unquote Reform Jew, in accepting and learning and outreaching and so on, they begin to realize that it's really something that transcends those
exactly.
labels.
So the bottom line is, get rid of all labels. We don't need the labels. The labels are only for our sake, perhaps, to be able to have a better concept of who we're dealing with, what we're talking about. But the bottom line is, and I think that message has to go out loud and clear to our audience, that we should all look at another Jew as another Jew. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. God doesn't send us a soul that has a label on it. You know, this is meant for a Reformed family. This is meant for an Orthodox family, or so forth and so on.
Right.
So once we get over that, we'll do a lot towards being able to relate to Judaism as the inheritance that it truly is. It didn't come to us in different packages that it's...
Without a doubt. You know, to bring it down to a more practical example, in my synagogue in Temple Bethel, there are different elements of Jews that we have, and there is an element that was left, that actually migrated from Eastern Europe, ran away from the war. In fact, I have certain congregants that actually lived through Auschwitz and were able to make it through the atrocities that took place within Germany and so on, and make it back to the States and start a life all over again. And often in our conversations together, I hear them saying, they call me Rebbe or Rev, whatever it is that they refer to me as in their own European accent. They say, when we were running in the carts, it didn't make a difference what language you spoke. A Jew is a Jew. And it didn't make a difference what background you were from or how you were labeled. And if you spoke Yiddish or not wasn't how he determined who he would get at the end of the day. And so a lot of that philosophy really has to be carried over to the contrary here in America, that it really, in terms of us reaching out and identifying and coming together and realizing that it's not about that labeling. It's not about the labeling. You really said it so succinctly. It's not about the labeling, Rabbi.
Just taking it one step further, if a secular Jew sees, quote-unquote, a religious Jew, and they think, oh, he's religious. So they feel there's a certain automatic separation sometimes between the two. But the fact is, Judaism is not a religion in the practical sense of the word. It's an inheritance. It's a covenant that we have with God, and we're fulfilling it perhaps on different rungs of the ladder. As the Rebbe talked very much about whether or not you're going up the ladder or down the ladder is really the key that a person should look at in terms of observance. So the question when we look at another individual, how to overcome those barriers, is realize, yes, that Jew might be, quote-unquote, religious. In other words, are taking their Judaism very seriously in terms of day-to-day observance. But they're still living the same type of life. They're still paying a mortgage. They still have a family. They still have the same challenges. But they're expressing it or dealing with it in a different way. Which gets us to another thing. And I want to get back to this issue. I don't want to let go of it. And that is, how do you explain to a person who has nothing to do with Judaism, who feels a total satisfaction with a secular lifestyle? Secular, I mean, let's say, is an American Jew. They have a Jewish identity. They perhaps go to synagogue 3 times a year. Maybe they do a little bit more than that. But it's really not a priority for them. It's not important to them because the influence of the secular world or the enjoyment that they have from the secular world is something that is very powerful and very overwhelming, especially if they grew up and were fed on it and had very little contact with anything Jewish. How can you bridge that gap, to be able to reach that person, which I'm sure there are people out here looking at your answer right now, to understand that there's something of value in Judaism, why I should incorporate Jewish values, quote unquote religious, which I'd like to just get rid of that word and just call it Jewish, and incorporate those values and make them part of my life without it being a contradiction. And I can still be secular, I can still enjoy the world, but I can enrich my life as a Jew.
It's interesting you asked that question. As I'm thinking while you're talking, to really answer that question in all fairness, I would say that's one of the classical messages of the Rebbe and his teachings, how we can integrate and how important it is to bring godliness on any level into our everyday life and into our secular life. Mm-hmm. And that is a misconception on the part of many people, that it's either or, and if you live a secular life, you can't integrate godliness into that. One of the examples that we have historically is when the Jewish people were traveling through the desert, and the spies were, then they were just surveyors of the land, were sent to the land which was then going to be the land of Israel, land of Canaan, to survey the land, and they came back with a report which seemed quite negative to the rest of the people. And the Jewish people were punished. And the Rebbe, in his talks, asks a question. Let's put things into perspective here. These were upstanding people, the leaders of the tribes and so on, and they were sent to do this mission. Did they fail in accomplishing their ultimate mission? And the Rebbe said that perhaps we have to understand the perspective that they were coming from. They were living in the desert, and they were living in a lifestyle that they were able to experience godliness and spirituality without having to toil, to sweat, to do anything that involves the worldly or the more physical or the more mundane aspects of life. And God then made it clear that that was a mistake. The purpose of creation was to actually go into the world with what the world has to offer and bring godliness within the world, elevate, well, it's a question of bringing down godliness or essentially elevating the godliness that exists. This has been the calling and the message of Chabadism for the last who knows how many years, that Jewish people have to realize that living a life in the suburbs, wherever it may be, whether it's New York or Long Island, in one of the most beautiful places in Long Island, coming from Long Beach, I think that it is a very secular city. People have to realize that bringing godliness into that lifestyle is not only not a paradox, but actually that is the greatest calling of why the world was created. When you can go out and appreciate...
It's a challenge that we have the privilege to be able to connect to.
Without a question. When we can live a life where we can appreciate our surroundings that we have and live within them and bring godliness into those surroundings, do whatever it is that your day calls for. Whether you're a professional, a doctor, or a lawyer, go to the gym, enjoy a very, very advanced secular life, and yet somewhere identify with godliness, that there is a higher calling in life, and experience that, whether it's at a Friday night meal, or experience it on a Shabbat morning, or experience it with any ritual that you may do. You're actually bringing the two different people perceive it as diametrically opposing components, but the truth of the matter is, Rabbi, that's the whole point of bringing these two things together. I think that what has evolved in the last few years at least within the city that I'm living in, is, as you mentioned earlier, the misconception, partially due to the ignorance, that you really can't have a mosaic of these two worlds coming together, and that's so not true. Mm-hmm. That's so not true.
You know, you also have something going on today in a spiritual revolution, as you referred to, of people wanting more of understanding really what the purpose behind all this is. But for many people also, even though they might be proponents of the spiritual revolution or personally involved with it, still it's difficult to be able to translate it into physical mitzvot, into physical traditions. You said, for instance, to pick a ritual and connect to godliness. Even that step for many people might be difficult because their experience with it has been very empty and very very meaningless, very cold. As they go into Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, they don't feel perhaps spiritual after they leave. When they're lighting a candle on Friday afternoon before sunset, they don't necessarily feel that spirituality. Again, again, the challenge is for each individual. And I'm not expecting an answer from you about this, but I think part of the challenge is realizing that Judaism and the traditions of Judaism are the conduit to be able to have that godly presence in the world. Not that it's restricted to that, because God is everywhere. There's no question about it. But the challenge for each individual is to find in their individual way how they can explore these 613 mitzvahs, explore the Torah in a way that they can find that unique connection, which will give them the door to be able to feel connected to it.
I don't know that now is the time, and I just want to comment on those beautiful few words that you just said. You know, often people say, and I often refer back to my relationship with Rabbi Herman, one of the critical differences between different dimensions of Judaism is the acceptance of halacha, and whether or not we have to actually put some of these ideals into ritualistic practice.
Right.
I don't want to get into a discourse now and exploring that we may do that at another opportunity, but I just want to say I often use a very simple, you know, you got to be real with the person, you got to study the human condition. When you're in any relationship, whether it's a relationship with your spouse or a relationship with your children, you have to nurture that relationship. You can't just think in your mind and feel in your heart your love. If you're not going to nurture it, it's going to die. The same is with God. You got to put things into practice and experience that love and experience that relationship in order to make it into a real relationship.
Yeah, definitely. I think part of the problem is people look at God as being spiritual and the world physical is different. And Judaism cracks constantly, is hacking all the time to realize, no, God is also in the earth, in the physical, and bring heaven down to earth. That's the challenge that we have, and that's the challenge that both of us try to teach from day to day.
Yes.
Rabbi Hecht, I thank you very much for your time. Please, can you give us a phone number at your synagogue, just in case anybody's interested in contacting you, asking questions, or following up on this discussion?
The best way to reach me is at the synagogue office, and the telephone number there is 516-432-1678.
Okay, 516-432
1678.
Okay, I hope everybody out there got that phone number, and I want to commend you for your work, and I hope that your board will continue to, as they have in the past, and I've heard many praises from you about your board and about the work that they've done with you, and I hope that you'll have much nachas from your synagogue and from much of your work.
And I reciprocate that with you. I wish you much hatzlacha in all of your work.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
So in the meantime, I just want everybody to perhaps in an eggshell, just look a little bit at, or a nutshell, look a little bit at what Rabbi Hecht has said as far as trying to bridge that gap and not looking at our life as being this dichotomy, because that dichotomy, it eats our kishkas out. It really eats us out from the inside, constantly feeling drawn from one end to the other, knowing perhaps our own principles and values on one hand and what we're drawn to have to do and other circumstances of our life, and to try our best to merge it. And I think you'll be surprised that learning of Judaism, whether it be chabadofcomac.com, chabad.org, it be other websites that we have that are really explore Torah in a way that you'll understand perfectly well, will help you have the tools to be able to bring together that physical and that spiritual aspect of your life. It's a great challenge, and I set it out for you. Good luck, and take care. We'll see you next week at the Jewish Spotlight.
Sim,